Hello everyone, in this video we'll be talking about composition. One fine morning, Johnny went to the market to go and buy... It's not the composition we're talking about. In visual arts, composition is the organization of elements within a certain canvas. As the artist, you have the power to influence how your audience perceive your image. You can make the audience look to the left or look to the right. In my opinion, composition is something that requires a lot of experience to fully utilize. However, I think it's important for us to know about the basic principles and be mindful whenever we draw to kind of apply these principles accordingly. Without further ado, let's go to the lesson. So here's an example. We have an apple, a grape, and a wine bottle. And depending on how we arrange these objects, we can tell different stories. In the first example, we have the apple beside the wine bottle and a grape placed far from both of them. The second example, all three of them are together. The third example, the wine bottle is toppled. The fourth example, the grape is situated far from the apple, which is situated far away from the wine bottle, suggesting some form of depth. In this case, even though the grape is the smallest item theoretically, it is the biggest in the canvas right now. But what if we shift the camera to a different perspective? In this example, it is kind of like a worm's eye view where we see the wine bottle towering over the apple and the grape. In this case, there is a certain narrative of the apple defending the grape from the bully that is the wine bottle. The sixth example is a bird's eye view of the three objects. The seventh example, we have the apple in the foreground and the wine bottle and the grape in the background. This kind of narrative suggests the wine bottle leaving the apple with a grape. And lastly, we have an example where the wine bottle is actually not in the canvas. You can see the wine bottle through its shadow that is casted on the apple and the grape. Over here, the narrative seems to suggest that the two of them are under attack, or it's in a very dangerous situation that they might be attacked by the wine bottle. Before we proceed with the design principles, I would like to cover three of the most basic compositional rules. The first rule is called the golden ratio. It is a derived number with an approximated value of 1.618. It is a proportion that is widely found in nature and man-made objects, ranging from architectural structures to works of art. The application of this ratio can be seen in popular paintings by superimposing the diagram of the Fibonacci's spiral on them. The focal point of these paintings usually occupies the smallest quadrant of the spiral diagram. The second rule is called the rule of thirds, and it is a simplification of the golden ratio. This rule simply states that by positioning objects of importance, be it the main subject of your painting or something you want to draw attention to, near the third of a canvas, you can produce results that are visually pleasing. The last rule I want to share with you is the rule of odds. It simply states that one of the simplest ways to make a composition more dynamic is to have an odd number in the composition. For example, instead of having just two characters in your scene, You may want to consider adding in another character to make the composition a little bit more dynamic. The reason why this rule works is because having an odd number of elements in the canvas inherently breaks the symmetry of the composition. In this lecture, I'll be using graphic design to explain some of the composition principles. The reason why I'm using graphic design rather than, visual design in terms of entertainment design is because graphic design is something that we are very much used to. We are exposed to this sort of imagery on a daily basis. When you walk out and you look at your notice board, you see a lot of posters and infographics that inform you of certain things. These are all graphic designs. Through graphic designs, we can understand how some of these theories help to attract the viewer and guide their eyes across your own drawings in the future. The very first principle that we are going to cover is called alignment. As the name suggests, alignment is the organization of elements relative to a line or margin. The image in the right is an example of how poor alignment can result in the misinterpretation of the message. For human beings, especially those who grow up reading English, it is common for us to scan our eyes from the left-hand side of the paper or the canvas or the screen to the right-hand side. The next principle is called balance, and it can be explained as the equality in terms of the weight and proportion of the elements on your canvas. Now, a lot of people always think that to achieve balance, the composition has to be symmetrical. In this example of a Frank Frazzetta's drawing, you can see that the composition itself is not symmetrical. To the left side of the female warrior, there is one single tiger, and to her right, we see there's a black panther and a chimpanzee. So in terms of composition, it is actually not symmetrical. But if we blur out the image and we just look at it in terms of the shapes, you can say that the composition is balanced because all four of these elements, the animals and the character, come together to form this very balanced kind of composition. And in fact, if we remove one of the animals, in this case the chimpanzee, you'll notice that the composition is kind of lopsided. One of the easiest ways to grab hold of a viewer's attention is through contrast. Contrast is achieved by a comparison between two elements on the canvas. So for example, you can play with contrasting colors, sizes, shapes, location, or even the relationship to one another. In this example, we have a cutesy anime little girl holding a ginormous mechanical weapon of mass destruction. So this in itself sets up the contrast between the relationship between this weapon and this character. Of course, we are also looking at different forms of contrast in terms of the color. The weapon is dark colored, the character is very light colored. We are also looking at the size. The weapon is long and huge. The character, by contrast, occupies a very small space on the screen. The fourth design principle is called emphasis. Emphasis is the act of making specific elements in the canvas stand out, or to draw attention of the viewer's eye to a specific location on the canvas. Emphasis can be achieved by using other design principles such as contrast, repetition, or movement. The fifth principle is called Gestalt, and this is a rather complicated term, so I'll just put it simply, Gestalt is the concept that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When you're looking at an image, you're not specifically focusing on that one paint stroke. You are looking at the entire picture. You are trying to form a complete image within your mind. You're not zooming in. When you're first looking at the image anyways, you're not zooming in on one particular area of detail. And I think this concept is very important to understand. Okay, let me show you an example first. This is an image from the Pokemon, I think 20th anniversary. And we can see that the different starter Pokemons are kind of grouped together in different colors to form a silhouette or a shape of Pikachu. And you can see the numbers 2 and 0 forming the red cheek of Pikachu. In this example, when you first glance upon this image, you are not looking at the individual Pokemon. You are actually looking at it as a whole and identifying it as, oh, this is a shape of Pikachu. And then on the second glance, you will start to see, oh, actually it's made up of all the various starter Pokemons. So in the same vein, when you are doing your drawing and eventually doing your painting next semester, I just want you guys to really remember this particular composition principle, because I find that very often a lot of students would zoom in to their canvas and just be obsessed about the little details, where they should actually spend more time looking at the bigger picture, making sure that the overall composition and the colors are correct before, going into the final details. Just like in music, graphical elements can also be said to be working in harmony, where individual elements on the canvas come together to create like a visually compelling and meaningful whole. Now, just to take note, for this particular principle, it is possible to kind of go against it to create this harmony. This really depends on the intended message that you want to send with your artwork. Movement. This is one of my favorite composition principles that I always try to implement in my own artwork. With movement, what you want to do is to kind of suggest a particular flow or particular direction that the characters or the elements within the canvas is heading towards. So in this example over here, we can see that it's a chase scene between this female protagonist, I guess, and two other male enemies that are chasing her down. And you can see that based on the alignment of these three characters, they are kind of flowing in this arc line, and it kind of suggests a movement where we know where the female character is actually leaping from. Like, we know that maybe 1 minute ago the female character, okay, maybe 1 minute is too long, 10 seconds ago the female character is on the ledge over there where this second male character is, and she made that leap and she's hanging off this handle. So this is, in my opinion, a very, very powerful tool to lead the viewer's eyes when the viewers start, because we know previously that the viewer will kind of glance from the left to the right if the viewer is an English speaker, and the eye would kind of settle on this first male character who is rounding the corners around the pillar, and then we will kind of like follow to this second male character who is trying to make that jump, and then finally to this female protagonist who is trying to escape from these two other guys. Proportion indicates the relative visual size of each element on the canvas. We have already kind of explored this composition principle in the example of the grape, the apple, and the wine bottle. In a sense, by placing the grape in the foreground close to the camera, you are actually making the grape look bigger than it actually is. Proximity is the distance between each individual element on the canvas. Close proximity indicates a connection of some sort. Repetition, when it comes to creating visuals, can be used in two different ways. The first one is to create some kind of textural noise. Sometimes you don't want to place too much emphasis or bring too much attention to a particular element. In that case, you might want to use repetition to establish some sort of monotony in that area so that the viewer will just take one glance and just ignore that area for the rest of the duration where the viewer is looking at an image. The second application of repetition is to kind of repeat the same object but in different sizes depending on how far or how near the objects are to the viewer. This is to establish some form of depth in the image. Sometimes it is inevitable that you need to repeat certain elements on the canvas. So rather than a more monotonous approach as discussed in the repetition principles, we can use rhythm to help us make the repetition process a little bit more interesting to look at. On the bottom, we have two different windows and how they are arranged on the image. The first example on the left is a more uniform distribution. Everything is kind of predictable, there's nothing too interesting about it. On the right hand side, you see that the windows are a little bit more scattered, the placement is a little bit more random. This in itself creates visual interest for the viewer. Unity creates a feeling of wholeness and can be achieved when different elements in the canvas share something similar in nature. So for example, they may be sharing the same white sauce. The way that the elements are lit is consistent. They may be sharing similar color schemes, so on and so forth. Lastly, we have white space, or what I would usually call negative space. This negative space is basically areas where there are little to no drawings or stuff being placed on the canvas. And you must be wondering why is a negative space or white space so important? Well, I think the works of MC Escher is one of the best examples of how you can use negative space to tell a story. Part of the lesson where we get to play Guess Which Art Principle this painting or image is using. Alright, the first image is the famous Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. Which principle is best represented in this image? Okay, in my opinion, the principle that is best represented in this image is that of movement. As you can see, the way he laid down his paint strokes, especially on the clouds, really, a very strong sense of movement and really guides the viewer's eyes across the painting. The next image is a painting, The Sistine Madonna by Raphael, the great Renaissance artist Raphael. Which principle is best represented in this image? Alright, to me, the principle that's best represented here out of the list would be balance. As you can see, the image, while not symmetrical, not perfectly symmetrical, is very balanced. Like, it is not lopsided to a particular side. The next image, we have a photo taken by Helena Lopez. which principle best describes or is best represented in this image. Okay, this is a pretty tricky one. I think there are two principles acting together to make this image successful. The first one is emphasis. You can see that because of a lack of distractions from the other elements, the photo is relatively uncluttered. Our attention is immediately drawn on the two characters, the two humans in the photo. The second principle that I think is working over here is negative space or white space, and that's one of the reasons why I think using white space is not a good term or ideal term to refer to this principle, even though it's in the course notes. But anyway, negative space can be black or can be any color as long as the area is devoid of anything, it's empty. The next image I have is a screenshot from the movie Sin City. Which principle best represented in this image? Okay, to me it's about contrast. I think because the movie is primarily grayscale, with the exception of colors used in certain areas. In this example, it is on the dress of this female character over here, so that red in the dress really pops the character out against the kind of a grayscale background. The next example I have over here is the logo for the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. Which principle is best represented here? Alright, to me it's a good example of alignment, as you can see how the text of the is aligned to the galaxy word. Similarly, you can see how the S on Guardians and the Y on Galaxy follows this very nice and clean kind of sort of alignment. For your homework today, you are required to take one photo that best represents each of the following composition principles. Now, you don't need a fancy camera, just your handphone camera is fine. Try to look around your house for any objects that you can arrange in an interesting manner to take the photo. Alright, since we are dealing with the screen resolution in our artworks in the future, it's best for us to make sure that the images that we capture when we are thinking about composition, we are thinking in this screen aspect ratio. So for your camera or your phone camera, make sure that you set it, instead of the full resolution, to be 16:9. 16:9, and take the photo in this resolution or in this aspect ratio.